share some more highlights with you from the Canadian Attitudes Towards Food and Farming study done in collaboration with Farm and Food Care Canada. Today we're going to talk a little bit about information sources. So where does the non-farming public learn about farming and food production, and how much do they really know about food and production practices? What's interesting, what we've seen in the past, is that predominantly the traditional media is the primary conduit through which the non-farming public learns about food and farming. Also, what we've learned in the past is that, generally speaking, the percentage of people that know a lot about farming in Canada is typically less than 10%. So let's see what some of our research tells us in this study. As we can see on the slide that I have here, this shows the percentage of Canadians who have learned about food and farming during the past 12 months from any of these sources. You can see I've drawn a box around those at the very top, because what we see here is that television is still the primary conduit for information. And within the television group, we have about 48% saying they've learned about food and farming from television program or news. Interestingly enough, though, you can see that 28%, or 1 in 4 Canadians, have learned about it through a documentary. Newspaper continues to be a leading resource, and the internet is also a leading resource at 30%, with websites being the primary area that this information comes from. So beyond the traditional media, we see a whole variety of other sources of information work that Canadians are learning about food and farming. And what's also interesting is 24% of Canadians indicated that they've learned about food and farming during the past 12 months from a farmer. Now, that could be directly, in person, or it could be indirectly through an interview that we see on the news, etc. However, it is interesting that about a quarter of Canadians are learning about food and farming directly from farmers over the past 12 months. One of the interesting trends in this research is where people are going by age group. And so the next slide I'm going to show you actually shows the differences between between younger Canadians and those and older Canadians in terms of how they use information to learn about food and farming. So let's take a look at that next slide. So this slide shows 3 lines, and the first line I'm going to draw your attention to is the line for internet. And we can see, and it's the line that has the 2 stars on each end. Here we can see that among 18 to 24-year-olds, 39% indicated they learned about food and farming from the internet. If we were to compare that against their use of television or farmers directly, we can see that the internet is actually the #1 source. That trend continues to be true until we hit 34 years of age, after which we see traditional media, specifically TV, become the primary source of information. And so the trend line that we see is actually the opposite for TV than it is for the internet. We can see that farmers as a source of information follows a similar trend to TV, meaning that, first of all, a couple things are important. Number one, that internet media is increasingly important among younger Canadians. And as we know, in our 20s and 30s, we establish our habitual behavior that we use for our entire lives. This tells us that online media is of utmost importance in communicating with younger Canadians. It also tells us that if we look at access to farmers as specific sources of information, that trend line is the reverse of the internet. So that means that we need to get more farmers communicating online and telling our story. So the final slide that I want to show you relates to how Canadians feel about information sources. It's one thing to have received a message from a specific source. It's a completely other thing to determine and understand how you feel or evaluate that source of information. In the past, we've found that sources of information that Canadians find to be warm or favorable also have stronger scores for believability as well, and it also speaks to the integrity of the message as it's delivered. So let's look at this last slide. As we can see here, we have a whole variety of potential information sources that Canadians indicate that they've learned about food or farming from. We can see here that I've circled 2 at the very top. The first one is friends, family, or word of mouth. That's 61%, rating them as a 5, 6, or 7 out of 7 in terms of providing a warm, favorable impression. What's really interesting here is that, okay, friends and family and word of mouth are #1, but farmers are #2. And they actually rate on par with friends and family for having a warm, favorable impression. Immediately underneath that, we have doctors, we have food retailers, agriculture, farm tours, and researchers, etc. So if we wanted to wrap up this summary of this section, what's most important, the key takeaways are that traditional media tends to be the primary conduits for information for the non-farming public, that the younger Canadians tend to be more online, and that in the future that's going to continue to become more important for the industry. And then finally, that our greatest asset for the industry today is the warm, favorable impression that Canadians have with Canadian farmers, and that we should continue to stimulate and to retain that image among Canadians.